there's always a danger in conversations about journalism with journalists, because there's a tendency, which is very advanced these days, for the news media to think that it's the story. And this becomes a somewhat, I think, circular conversation. I'm not sure that this is really the revolutionary development of our times. I'm in the midst of writing a book in which a great deal of the action takes place in the 1970s. What was the equivalent disaster which everybody was thinking about then? The answer is the Vietnam War. Hardly need to tell Martin this. And there was an official narrative, which was that domino theory required the United States to shore up the government of Vietnam. And then it became clear that that was not entirely true. And with the publication of the Pentagon Papers, the public was suddenly treated to an inside account of what, in fact, had happened in the 1960s and the reasons for the escalation in Vietnam under Lyndon Johnson. There then was an attempt to shut that door, disastrously unsuccessful attempt, that then contributed to the crisis of the legitimacy of Richard Nixon's administration. If one goes back through the news coverage of Vietnam and then of Watergate, it's striking to me how familiar the discussions are. On one side, there's an administration that's abusing its power and seeking to exert pressure, not only on its political opponents, but on its opponents in the press, ultimately resorting to illegal means to do that. On the other side, you have a public that is increasingly polarized on the issue, and there are indeed outbreaks of violence in the period, as well as a general sense of disenchantment with the system. So whenever people tell me that there's something very special about our situation in 2023, I say, could I introduce you to 1973? And you won't find that our position is a whole lot worse. In fact, it's very similar. The Trump presidency ended with a massive crisis of legitimacy January the 6th. And the Nixon presidency, of course, ended in Watergate. Impeachment played a part in both cases. And the media became a story, which is what the media really loves. The New York Times loves nothing better than reporting on the New York Times. And I think that's all pretty familiar. The novel thing, and here, Martin, you may disagree with me or you may agree wholeheartedly, the novel thing is clearly the internet and the advent of social media, to use the term casually, because ultimately traditional media have become quite reliant on social media for raw content. And I think the novel thing is really the way in which news has become structurally different in the age of the internet. That the old institutions play their old game. Governments try to manipulate the media. The newspapers want to write about themselves. That's all old hat. But what's novel is platforms such as Twitter, but also increasingly TikTok, in which a considerable amount of power is given to the user, to ordinary people who aren't journalists, to generate news and commentary. And of course, and both Martin and I have written about this, the ecosystem of the internet went from being very decentralized to being quite centralized around network platforms very fast. It became monetized through ad sales. It became corrupted by bots. It's continuing to be corrupted. The corruption will not stop, and it will get worse with artificial intelligence. And that's what's new. Not the stuff about traditional media, not the ways in which government tried to manipulate it, but the complete transformation of the nature of news and our perception of the news by the internet and the network platforms.
Well, I would say I probably have an advantage over you, Neil. You look very distinguished and graying, but I am way older than you are. I was there in the 70s, okay? And my sense is there were many similarities. There were profound differences. I think at the core, the Vietnam era, Vietnam controversy was about shared values, who was right and who was wrong. All right. And I think once it took a long time for the American public, actually took years and years. And I was a young man waiting to see whether I was going to be drafted or not at that time. It took years to tip over into a majority of the public being against the war. It took a lot of television theater in the Senate to persuade people that what Nixon had done made it impossible for him to stay president. But we were debating more or less within a single moral structure, within a single belief about facts, all right? I think the place we're at right now is extraordinarily different. I think the causes are what you mentioned. I think it's this gigantic upsurge of information, this gigantic babble of voices that Jonathan Haidt calls the Tower of Babel. And what we are debating today, what is in dispute on almost every occasion, is not the facts, but the frameworks that constitute the facts. So there's a battle of frameworks that goes back and forth, and the framework seems to shift in the strangest way, since there's no authority from the top. And I guess we could start with that. Since the elites have lost trust, and they're the ones who interpret the world for us. I mean, when Nixon was basically forced to resign, poor Ford stepped in. I mean, this is a guy who had been in Congress all his life. And I mean, pretty much everybody rallied behind him. It's not like we were cheering, but everybody rallied behind him. He had at least our best wishes. Right now, there is no trust. There is no ability to gather trust, because unless you can live in the same framework, you can't persuade people of anything. And I think that is a profound consequence of the tsunami of information that has bashed institutions that simply were not adapted for it.
It seems to me that we're not that far apart. I mean, in the end, I think if one asks how big a disruption has there been in our time, you could say much as Martin has said. Well, Trump went so far as to instigate insurrection, and that was one of the great bungled coup attempts of modern times. But actually, the system withstood that. Joe Biden himself, a 1970s figure, became president.
Sure, but in part, that's because of the incompetence of the planning.
In part, I mean, it's hard to dignify it with the word planning, but the point is the continuity of the system striking. Joe Biden's sworn in embarks on an entirely classic progressive democratic governmental course. We're going to spend more money. We're going to grow the government.
Progressive in the original 20th century sense.
In the original sense of Roosevelt and Johnson, and quietly retains a number of Trump's policies. And so we had a very shocking event. But what's really interesting to me is how very quickly we moved on. And this may be a big difference between then and now. News cycles have become much shorter. I was looking at some interesting data on that this week. You know, the average story has a 3-week lifespan. If you had told me even a year ago that the US government would announce that it had shot down unidentified flying objects over the United States, I would have said, man, that'll be the biggest story of 2023 and maybe of the 2020s. The UFO, I mean, they called them unidentified flying objects, and that story was gone in even less than 3 weeks. So I think what's fascinating to me is this extraordinary attention deficit disorder that means that news is news, even a coup, even our UFOs over America. It's like, yeah, that was interesting for 2 weeks, but week 3, it's like, next. That I think is different, because in the 70s, Watergate was a story for 3 years. And I mean, it was really amazing how long that story kept going. And the journalists unceasingly drummed it into people, even when there was viewer and reader fatigue.